Alexander the Great. Part 1. The Rise of a Conqueror. A kingdom destined for greatness. In 334 BC, a young king from the rugged mountains of Macedonia embarked on a campaign that would forever change the ancient world. His name was Alexander. At only 20 years old, he faced an enemy unlike any other, the mighty Persian Empire. It was the largest and wealthiest empire on earth, stretching from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India. Its kings ruled over millions of people, commanded enormous armies, and controlled unimaginable riches. Against such overwhelming power, Alexander's chances appeared almost non-existent. Yet over the next 10 years, he would accomplish what no Greek ruler had ever imagined. He would defeat the Persians, conquer lands across 3 continents, and establish one of history's greatest empires. To many Persians, he became known as Alexander the Accursed. To history, he would be remembered by another name: Alexander the Great. Greece before Alexander. Around 500 BC, ancient Greece entered one of the most remarkable periods in human history. Unlike vast centralized kingdoms, Greece consisted of dozens of independent city-states, each with its own government, army, and ambitions. Among them, 2 stood above all others. Athens dominated the seas. It became famous for democracy, philosophy, literature, architecture, and the arts. Thinkers such as Socrates, Plato, and later Aristotle transformed the intellectual world. Meanwhile, Sparta followed an entirely different path. Every aspect of Spartan society revolved around military discipline. From childhood, Spartan boys were trained to become warriors, creating one of the most feared armies of the ancient world. Despite their rivalry, both city-states faced a common threat: the expanding Persian Empire. In 480 BC, King Xerxes I launched one of the largest invasions ever seen in antiquity. At the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae, a small Greek force led by King Leonidas and his famous 300 Spartans resisted the massive Persian army for 3 days. Although they were eventually surrounded and killed, their sacrifice became one of history's greatest symbols of courage. Not long afterward, the Greeks achieved a stunning naval victory at the Battle of Salamis, crippling Persian sea power. Even so, the Persians succeeded in occupying Athens, burning the sacred temples of the Acropolis before withdrawing. The following year, in 479 BC, the united Greek army defeated the Persians decisively at the Battle of Plataea, bringing the invasion to an end. The fall of Greek unity. The next 50 years became the golden age of classical Greece. Art flourished. Philosophy reached new heights. Science advanced rapidly. Magnificent temples rose across the Greek world. But prosperity gave way to rivalry. Tensions between Athens and Sparta eventually erupted into the devastating Peloponnesian War. The conflict lasted for decades, drawing nearly every Greek city-state into an endless cycle of battles, shifting alliances, and political instability. Even after peace returned, warfare continued. Generation after generation, the Greek world exhausted itself. Its cities were weakened. Its armies diminished. Its unity disappeared. While Greece looked inward, a new kingdom was quietly growing stronger beyond its northern frontier. The rise of Macedonia. For centuries, many Greeks considered Macedonia a backward kingdom inhabited by uncivilized highlanders. That perception changed dramatically under one remarkable ruler, King Philip II. A gifted statesman and brilliant military reformer, Philip transformed Macedonia into the strongest military power in Greece. His greatest innovation was the sarissa, a pike nearly 18 feet long, roughly twice the length of the traditional Greek spear. Equipped with these enormous weapons, Macedonian infantry fought in tightly organized formations known as the phalanx. When thousands of soldiers lowered their sarissas simultaneously, they created an almost impenetrable wall of spear points capable of breaking nearly any opposing force. Philip also strengthened his cavalry, improved battlefield coordination, and built one of the most professional armies of the ancient world. The results soon became impossible to ignore. In 338 BC, Philip met the combined forces of Athens and Thebes at the Battle of Chaeronea. The Macedonian victory was complete. For the first time in history, nearly all of Greece came under the leadership of a single ruler. Philip established the Hellenic League, also known as the League of Corinth, with himself as its supreme commander. Only Sparta refused to join. With Greece united behind him, Philip prepared for the greatest campaign of his life. His target was the aging but still powerful Persian Empire. After generations of conflict between Greece and Persia, Philip intended to carry the war into Asia itself. But fate intervened. Before the invasion could begin, Philip too was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards during a royal celebration. His ambitious plans now rested in the hands of his son, the young king. At just 20 years old, Alexander inherited both the Macedonian throne and his father's unfinished dream. Many doubted that someone so young could hold the kingdom together. They underestimated him. Educated by the philosopher Aristotle, Alexander possessed an extraordinary curiosity about the world. He was intelligent, charismatic, fearless, and already an experienced battlefield commander. Yet before invading Persia, he first had to secure his own kingdom. Potential rivals were eliminated. Rebellions in Thessaly, Illyria, and central Greece were crushed with astonishing speed. The harshest punishment fell upon Thebes. After the city revolted, Alexander ordered it destroyed. Most of its population was sold into slavery, while the city itself was reduced to ruins. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would not be tolerated. The shockwaves spread across Greece. No other city dared challenge the young king. The beginning of an epic campaign. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander finally set his father's vision into motion. Leading the Macedonian army across the Hellespont into Asia Minor, he crossed from Europe into the heart of the Persian Empire. Few could have imagined that this crossing would mark the beginning of one of the greatest military campaigns ever recorded. Ahead lay impossible odds. Ahead lay legendary battles. Ahead waited King Darius III himself. And the destiny of empires was about to be decided. Alexander the Great. Part 2. The First Clash with Persia. The army that would change history. When Alexander crossed the Hellespont in the spring of 334 BC, he did not command the largest army in the ancient world. He commanded one of the best. His force numbered approximately 40,000 soldiers, assembled from every corner of Greece and Macedonia. It was an army shaped by years of reform under Philip II and refined by relentless training. Every unit had a precise role, every officer understood his mission, and every soldier trusted the man leading them. Alexander knew that discipline, not numbers, would decide the coming war. At the heart of his army stood the legendary Macedonian phalanx. Roughly 9,000 Macedonian phalangites formed its core. Armed with the fearsome 18-foot sarissa, these professional soldiers fought shoulder to shoulder in tightly packed ranks, usually 16 men deep. When advancing together, thousands of spear points projected toward the enemy, creating an almost unstoppable wall of steel. Few armies could survive a direct collision with such a formation. But the phalanx had weaknesses. Its massive pikes limited mobility, making it vulnerable to attacks against its flanks or rear. To protect those exposed sides, Alexander deployed 3,000 elite infantrymen known as the Hydaspes, or shield-bearers. Equipped with shorter spears and larger shields, they were far more flexible than the phalanx and could react quickly wherever the battle demanded. They were commanded by Nicanor, the son of Alexander's trusted general Parmenion. Behind the Macedonian infantry stood another 7,000 Greek allied soldiers alongside nearly 5,000 mercenary hoplites. Though they carried shorter spears than the Macedonian phalangites, they remained heavily armored veterans capable of holding the line under enormous pressure. Alexander also relied on highly skilled light troops. Among the finest were the Agrianians, elite javelin throwers recruited from what is now southern Bulgaria. Alongside them fought warriors from Thrace and Illyria, armed with bows, slings, and throwing spears. These soldiers screened the army, harassed enemy formations, and created opportunities for heavier units to strike. Yet the true striking force of Alexander's army rode on horseback. The companion cavalry. The elite companion cavalry represented the finest horsemen in Macedonia. Numbering around 1,800 cavalrymen, they fought with long spears and swords and were trained to exploit even the smallest weakness in an enemy line. Their commander was Philotas, another son of Parmenion. Alexander himself rode with the royal squadron. Unlike many kings of the ancient world, he did not observe battles from a safe distance. Whenever the decisive moment arrived, Alexander personally led the charge. Supporting the companions were another 1,800 Thessalian cavalry, commanded by Collos, approximately 600 Greek horsemen under Arigius, and 900 mounted scouts from Thrace and Paeonia, commanded by Cassander. Each formation had been carefully organized. Each commander knew his role. Alexander had inherited an exceptional army. Soon, it would face its first great test. Persia responds. The Persian Empire stretched across an immense territory, divided into administrative provinces known as satrapies. Each satrapy was governed by a provincial ruler, a satrap. As reports of Alexander's invasion spread through Asia Minor, the Persian governors gathered to decide how to stop the Macedonian advance. Among them stood one man whose advice might have changed history: Memnon of Rhodes. Although Greek by birth, Memnon served Persia as one of its most experienced generals. He understood Alexander's strengths. Rather than confronting the Macedonians in open battle, Memnon proposed a different strategy: destroy the crops, burn the villages, withdraw deeper into the empire. Without food or supplies, Alexander's army would eventually collapse from starvation. From a military perspective, it was brilliant advice. But the satraps refused. They would not destroy their own lands without fighting. Confident in their superior numbers, they chose to meet Alexander in battle. Their chosen battlefield was the river Granicus. It would become the first major confrontation between Macedonia and Persia. The Persian deployment. The Granicus River was not especially deep. However, it stretched nearly 60 feet across, with steep banks that made crossing under enemy attack extremely dangerous. The Persians positioned their army along the opposite bank. Their front line consisted of nearly 10,000 cavalry, gathered from every corner of the empire. There were Medes, Hyrcanians, Bactrians, and Paphlagonians, each bringing their own weapons, traditions, and fighting styles. Behind them waited the infantry reserve. Most were experienced Greek mercenaries. These professional soldiers fought not for patriotism, but for Persian gold. Armed as traditional hoplites, they were among the finest infantry available to the great king. Some Persian commanders questioned whether these Greeks could be trusted against fellow Greeks. As a result, they were positioned behind the cavalry instead of leading the defense. It was a decision that would soon prove costly. Alexander makes his move. Alexander had no intention of allowing the Persian army to retreat deeper into Asia Minor. He wanted a decisive battle. Fast. Ignoring suggestions that he should wait until dawn for better conditions, Alexander chose immediate action. He divided his forces with characteristic precision. On the left wing stood the Thessalian, Greek, and Thracian cavalry, commanded by Parmenion. The center belonged to the mighty Macedonian phalanx, divided into 6 formations under Perdiccas, Koinos, Amintas, Philip, Meleager, and Crateros. Alexander personally commanded the right wing. Alongside him rode the companion cavalry, supported by the Hydaspes, the Agrianian javelin throwers, and his archers. Altogether, he prepared to attack with roughly 13,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. The Persians may have held a numerical advantage. Alexander intended to overwhelm them with speed. The Battle of the Granicus. Without hesitation, Alexander gave the order. A squadron of companion cavalry entered the river first. Close behind came the Hydaspes and the light cavalry from Paeonia. Then Alexander himself spurred his horse forward, leading the right wing into the rushing water. As the Macedonians reached the middle of the river, Persian missiles filled the sky. Arrows, javelins, darts, The crossing quickly turned into chaos. Those who managed to climb the opposite bank were immediately met by charging Persian cavalry. The fighting became brutal. Horse crashed into horse. Shield slammed against shield. Neither side gave ground. Alexander placed himself at the very center of the struggle. His objective was not simply to win the cavalry fight. He was buying precious time. Every moment the Persians focused on him allowed more Macedonian infantry to cross the river. Soon, the unstoppable phalanx would arrive. And once it did, the balance of the battle would change forever. Just as the fighting reached its fiercest point, Alexander suddenly found himself surrounded by Persian nobles. One of them, Rosaces, struck Alexander on the head with his sword. The blow shattered part of the king's helmet. Only the strength of the bronze prevented the blade from splitting his skull. Alexander immediately counterattacked, driving his lance into Rosaces and killing him. But another Persian noble, Spithridates, galloped in from behind. Raising his sword, he prepared to deliver the fatal blow. At the last possible moment, Clitus the Black, son of Dropidas, charged into the melee. With a single swing, he severed Spithridates' arm before the weapon could strike Alexander. The king had escaped death by only a heartbeat. The battle, however, was far from over. Alexander the Great Part 3. Victory at the Granicus. The turning point. As fierce fighting raged along the banks of the river Granicus, Alexander's gamble was beginning to pay off. While the Persian cavalry remained locked in combat with the Macedonian king, more and more of his soldiers successfully crossed the river. Then came the moment the Persians had hoped to prevent. The Macedonian phalanx reached the opposite bank. Thousands of soldiers lowered their 18-foot sarissas in perfect unison and advanced as a single unstoppable wall of steel. The battlefield changed instantly. Persian cavalry, so effective in open maneuvering, suddenly found itself trapped against an enemy formation designed to crush frontal attacks. Unable to break the advancing line, their ranks began to collapse. What had started as a confident defense quickly turned into desperate resistance. The collapse of the Persian cavalry. Alexander recognized the opportunity immediately. Without hesitation, he ordered the companion cavalry to press the attack. The Macedonian horsemen struck with overwhelming force. Already shaken by the relentless advance of the phalanx, the Persian cavalry could no longer maintain its formation. One squadron after another abandoned the battlefield. Soon, what had been an organized withdrawal became a full-scale rout. For the Macedonians, the first stage of the battle was won. But another enemy force still remained untouched. The fate of the Greek mercenaries. Behind the fleeing cavalry stood several thousand experienced Greek mercenaries serving the Persian Empire. Because the Persian commanders had deployed them behind the cavalry, they had barely participated in the battle. Now they stood alone, surrounded, cut off from any possibility of escape. Realizing the battle had already been lost, many attempted to negotiate. They appealed to Alexander for mercy. The Macedonian king refused. Whether he viewed them as traitors for fighting against fellow Greeks or simply wished to make an example of them remains uncertain. Whatever his reasoning, his decision was final. The Macedonian army surrounded the mercenaries on every side. The fighting that followed was brief and merciless. Most were killed where they stood. Those who survived were taken prisoner and condemned to forced labor. Alexander intended to send a clear message throughout the Greek world. Serving Persia against Greece would carry the harshest possible consequences. Alexander's first great victory. The Battle of the Granicus ended in a decisive Macedonian victory. Alexander had defeated the first major Persian army sent to stop his invasion. More importantly, he had shattered the illusion that the armies of the Persian Empire were unbeatable. The road into Asia Minor now lay open. One city after another would soon face a difficult choice. Resist or surrender. The surrender of Sardis. Alexander wasted no time. Marching south, he approached Sardis, the capital of the Persian province of Lydia. Unlike the commanders at Granicus, the governor of Sardis understood the situation. Rather than risk the destruction of one of Persia's richest cities, he surrendered without a fight. Alexander accepted the city's submission peacefully. Its enormous treasury, strategic location, and powerful fortress now belonged to Macedonia. It was a significant political victory as well as a military one. By showing mercy to those who surrendered, Alexander encouraged other cities to do the same. Every bloodless victory saved time, manpower, and resources. The Persian fleet remains a threat. Despite his success on land, Alexander faced a serious strategic problem. The Persian navy still controlled much of the eastern Mediterranean. Its fleet was larger than his own and operated from heavily fortified coastal bases. As long as Persian warships dominated the sea, Alexander's communication and supply lines with Greece remained vulnerable. Rather than challenge Persia at sea, a battle he was unlikely to win, Alexander chose a different strategy. If he could capture the ports themselves, the fleet would lose its bases. Without secure harbors, even the strongest navy could not survive. It was another example of Alexander solving a problem indirectly rather than confronting it head-on. The Siege of Miletus. His first objective was the coastal city of Miletus. Protected by strong walls and supported by the Persian fleet, the city expected a lengthy siege. Instead, Alexander moved quickly. His engineers brought forward siege equipment while his troops isolated the city from the surrounding countryside. The defenders resisted fiercely, hoping Persian ships would break the blockade. Help never arrived in time. After determined fighting, Miletus fell into Macedonian hands. Alexander had captured one of Persia's most important naval bases, Halicarnassus. The next obstacle proved even more formidable. The city of Halicarnassus possessed massive fortifications and experienced defenders. Among those organizing the defense was Memnon of Rhodes, whose strategic advice the Persian satraps had ignored before the Battle of the Granicus. Now he intended to make Alexander pay for every step forward. The siege became one of the toughest campaigns of Alexander's early invasion. Massive siege towers advanced toward the walls. Battering rams pounded ancient stone. Defenders launched repeated counterattacks, setting fire to Macedonian siege engines whenever an opportunity appeared. Street fighting erupted inside sections of the city after parts of the walls collapsed. Although the defenders fought with determination, Alexander gradually forced them back. Recognizing that further resistance was hopeless, Memnon withdrew much of his force by sea. The city eventually fell. By the end of the campaign season, Alexander controlled most of the southwestern coast of Asia Minor. A new campaign begins. Winter passed. In the spring of 333 BC, Alexander resumed his advance. His army marched through Lycia and into Phrygia, encountering little organized resistance. Persian authority across Western Asia Minor was steadily collapsing. Every victory increased Alexander's prestige. Every surrendered city strengthened his growing empire. Yet one stop along the journey would become far more famous than any battlefield: the Gordian Knot. In the ancient city of Gordium, Alexander encountered one of the most celebrated legends of the ancient world. Inside a sacred sanctuary rested an elaborate knot tied to an ancient wagon. According to prophecy, whoever succeeded in untying the Gordian knot would become ruler of all Asia. Many had tried. None had succeeded. Alexander examined the knot carefully. Then, instead of attempting to untie it, he drew his sword. With a single powerful stroke, he cut straight through it. Whether the prophecy referred to patience or determination no longer mattered. The knot was undone. To his followers, it appeared to be yet another sign that destiny favored their king. Trouble behind the lines. While Alexander continued deeper into Asia Minor, events elsewhere threatened to undermine his campaign. Memnon of Rhodes, still commanding the Persian fleet, launched an ambitious counteroffensive across the Aegean Sea. Persian warships captured the islands of Chios and Lesbos, raising fears that Greece itself might soon revolt against Macedonian rule. For the first time since crossing the Hellespont, Alexander's position appeared uncertain. Had Memnon remained alive, Persia might have shifted the balance of the entire war. But fate intervened once again. Memnon suddenly died from illness. Without his leadership, the Persian offensive lost momentum. The campaign was abandoned before it could threaten Macedonia's control over Greece. Alexander had escaped what may have been the greatest strategic danger of his entire invasion. He now turned his attention eastward. A far greater enemy was finally on the move. For nearly 18 months, the King of Kings, Darius III, had been gathering the full military strength of the Persian Empire. The decisive confrontation was approaching. Soon, Alexander would face not provincial governors, but the ruler of Persia himself. The battlefield would be called Issus. Alexander the Great Part 4. The Battle of Issus. The King of Kings makes his move. By the autumn of 333 BC, Alexander had spent more than a year campaigning across Asia Minor. City after city had surrendered. Persian authority in the west was collapsing. But Alexander knew these victories were only the beginning. The true war had yet to be fought. Far to the east, Darius III, the great king of the Persian Empire, had finally assembled the empire's main field army. Drawing troops from every corner of his vast realm, Darius intended to crush the Macedonian invasion in a single decisive battle. Unlike the satraps defeated at the river Granicus, the great king possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. By many ancient estimates, his army outnumbered Alexander's by nearly 2-1. Confident in his strength, Darius marched west in search of the Macedonians. The decisive encounter was now unavoidable. A dangerous surprise. Alexander had advanced into Cilicia, preparing to cross the Nur Mountains and continue south into Syria. Believing the Persian army remained ahead of him, he continued his march. Then unexpected news arrived. Darius had executed a bold maneuver. Rather than waiting for Alexander, the Persian king had marched around the Macedonian army through a different mountain route. Suddenly, the Persians appeared behind Alexander. The situation was extremely dangerous. Not only had Darius cut Alexander's line of communication back toward Asia Minor, but he had also captured the town of Issus, where many wounded Macedonian soldiers had been left behind. Alexander immediately reversed his march. The two armies now moved toward one another. Neither side intended to retreat. The battlefield. Darius chose to deploy his army near the Panaris River on the narrow coastal plain close to Issus. At first glance, the location seemed ideal. Mountains rose sharply to one side. The Mediterranean Sea bordered the other. Only a strip of land, roughly 6 miles wide, separated them. Ironically, this battlefield worked against Persia. The narrow terrain prevented Darius from using his greatest advantage, his superior numbers. Instead of surrounding Alexander, much of the Persian army would never have room to fight. Alexander immediately recognized the opportunity. He would face only a portion of the Persian army at any one time. The Persian army. Although ancient historians often claimed Darius commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers, modern estimates suggest his army may have numbered around 100,000 men. Even so, it remained one of the largest forces Alexander would ever face. At its center stood thousands of experienced Greek mercenary hoplites. These professional soldiers represented some of the finest infantry available in the Persian service. Surrounding them were infantry contingents gathered from across the empire. On the Persian right, nearest the sea, Darius concentrated his strongest cavalry, hoping the open ground would allow them to overwhelm Alexander's left wing. Behind the battle line stood the great king himself. From his magnificent royal chariot, Darius watched his enormous army prepare for battle. Confident in his numbers, he expected victory. Alexander's deployment. Alexander arranged his forces in the formation that had already brought him success. On the left wing, closest to the sea, Parmenion commanded the Thessalian cavalry, supported by Greek infantry and allied horsemen. The center remained the responsibility of the Macedonian phalanx. Its disciplined veterans would once again carry the burden of breaking the enemy line. Alexander personally took command of the right wing. With him stood the elite companion cavalry, the Hydaspes, the Agrianians, and his archers. Before the battle began, Alexander noticed the enormous concentration of Persian cavalry opposite Parmenion. Recognizing the danger, he transferred additional Thessalian cavalry to reinforce the threatened left flank. Even before the first spear was thrown, he was already adapting to the battlefield. The battle begins. Darius remained behind the Panaris River, forcing Alexander to attack. The Macedonian king did not hesitate. Riding along the line, he encouraged his soldiers personally. Many veterans heard their names called by the king himself. It was one of Alexander's greatest strengths. He inspired loyalty not from a distant throne, but from the front ranks of battle. Then he gave the order to advance. The Macedonian army surged forward. Alexander led the right wing directly toward the Persian left. His cavalry accelerated into a full charge. The speed of the attack immediately placed the Persian defenders under tremendous pressure. The left side of Darius' line began falling back. But while Alexander gained ground on one side of the battlefield, events in the center unfolded very differently. Crisis in the center. Trying to keep pace with Alexander's rapid advance, sections of the Macedonian phalanx lost their perfect alignment. Small gaps opened between the formations. The experienced Greek mercenaries serving Darius recognized the opportunity instantly. Charging into those openings, they struck the Macedonian center with tremendous force. For perhaps the first time during the invasion, Alexander's famous phalanx found itself in serious danger. Fierce hand-to-hand fighting erupted. Long sarissas became difficult to use at close quarters. The battle dissolved into brutal combat with swords and shields. Several Macedonian units began giving ground. If the center collapsed, Alexander's entire army could be divided in two. Everything now depended on the king himself. Alexander's decisive charge. Seeing the danger, Alexander acted immediately. He gathered the companion cavalry and wheeled toward the Persian center. The charge was devastating. Instead of continuing his attack along the flank, Alexander struck directly toward the position of Darius III himself. The impact shattered the cohesion of the Persian line. The Greek mercenaries, suddenly threatened from the side, lost their momentum. The Macedonian phalanx recovered. Its soldiers reformed their ranks and resumed their advance. At the same time, Alexander continued driving deeper into the Persian center. His objective was no longer merely to win the battle. He intended to reach the great king. The flight of Darius. As Alexander drew closer, panic spread through the Persian command. The Macedonian king seemed unstoppable. Wherever he attacked, enemy formations broke apart. Watching Alexander cut through his elite troops, Darius III made a decision that would define his reputation forever. Rather than stand and fight, he turned his chariot around. The King of Kings fled the battlefield. Once the royal standard began moving away, confusion swept through the Persian army. Thousands of soldiers believed the battle had already been lost. Discipline collapsed. Entire formations abandoned their positions. The retreat quickly became a rout. Parmenion held the line. Victory, however, was not yet guaranteed. On Alexander's left wing, Parmenion still faced the strongest Persian cavalry. Wave after wave of mounted warriors crashed into the Macedonian defenses. The fighting became desperate. Had the Persians broken through there, they might have surrounded Alexander's army and reversed the outcome of the battle. But Parmenion refused to yield. His soldiers fought with remarkable determination. Minute after minute, they held their ground. Finally, news spread across the battlefield. The great king had fled. Persian morale collapsed instantly. One cavalry unit after another disengaged and joined the general retreat. Parmenion had survived. The Macedonian line remained intact. The battle was over. A stunning victory. The Battle of Issus became one of Alexander's greatest achievements. Against overwhelming odds, he had defeated the personal army of the King of Kings. Thousands of Persian soldiers lay dead across the battlefield. According to later accounts, so many bodies filled a nearby ravine that Macedonian troops crossed it using the fallen as a bridge. Among the spoils of victory were members of the Persian royal family. Darius III's mother, his wife, and his 3 children had all been captured alive. Many expected Alexander to execute them or display them as trophies. Instead, he treated them with dignity and respect. It was an act that surprised both friend and foe alike. Yet despite another crushing defeat, the Persian Empire was not finished. Darius had escaped. And as long as the great king remained alive, the war would continue. Alexander now turned south. His next objective was not Persia's capital, but the wealthy cities of Phoenicia and Egypt. Before he could destroy the Persian Empire, he first had to destroy its power at sea. Alexander the Great Part 5. The Fall of Tyre and the Conquest of Egypt. The war moved south. The victory at Issus in 333 BC transformed the course of the war. For the second time, Darius III had escaped. Although the Persian field army had been defeated, the Persian Empire remained a formidable power. Its greatest advantage was no longer on land, it was at sea. The Persian navy still controlled much of the eastern Mediterranean, operating from powerful naval bases along the coast of Phoenicia. As long as those ports remained in Persian hands, Alexander's supply lines to Greece could be threatened at any moment. Instead of chasing Darius into the heart of the empire, Alexander made a strategic decision. He would eliminate Persia's naval power first. That meant conquering every major port along the eastern Mediterranean coast. Only then could he safely continue east. The cities of Phoenicia. Alexander advanced into Phoenicia, where several important cities quickly accepted his authority. Most local rulers understood that resisting the Macedonian army offered little chance of success. Rather than face destruction, they opened their gates. One city, however, refused. Its walls had never been breached. Its fleet was among the strongest in the Mediterranean. Its people believed their island fortress was impossible to capture. That city was Tyre, the island fortress. Unlike most ancient cities, Tyre stood on an island nearly 1 kilometer from the mainland. Massive stone walls rose directly from the sea, reaching heights of almost 150 feet in some places. Powerful warships guarded its harbors. From every perspective, Tyre appeared impregnable. Alexander demanded that the city surrender peacefully. The Tyrians refused. Confident in their defenses, they believed no army could ever reach them. The siege that followed would become one of the greatest engineering achievements of the ancient world. Building a road across the sea. Without a fleet capable of attacking the island directly, Alexander devised an extraordinary solution. He ordered his army to build a massive causeway from the mainland to the island itself. Thousands of soldiers began carrying stones, timber, and rubble into the sea. Day after day, the artificial roadway slowly extended toward Tyre. The defenders watched from the city walls. Soon they began striking back. Archers showered the workers with arrows. Warships attacked the construction crews. Heavy stones crashed down from towering walls. Progress became painfully slow. Yet Alexander refused to abandon the project. Every setback only strengthened his determination. Fire on the water. As the causeway crept closer to the island, Alexander constructed enormous siege towers. Mounted on the advancing roadway, these towering wooden structures carried archers and powerful catapults designed to suppress the defenders. The Tyrians answered with remarkable ingenuity. They filled an old transport ship with dry wood, pitch, sulfur, and other flammable materials. Waiting for favorable winds, they set the vessel ablaze and sent it drifting toward the Macedonian siege towers. Moments later, the burning ship slammed into the causeway. Flames spread rapidly. The enormous towers caught fire. Workers scrambled in every direction as the entire structure collapsed into the sea. Months of work vanished in a single afternoon. Many commanders might have abandoned the siege. Alexander did not. The siege tightens. Recognizing that Tyre could not be taken from land alone, Alexander assembled a powerful fleet from recently conquered Phoenician ports and allied Cypriot cities. The balance of power changed immediately. For the first time, Tyre faced blockade from every direction. Its harbors were sealed. Supplies dwindled. Escape became impossible. Meanwhile, the causeway continued advancing. Battering rams pounded the walls. Catapults hurled massive stones into the city. Every day the pressure increased. After 7 months of relentless fighting, a section of Tyre's walls finally collapsed. Alexander gave the order for the assault. The fall of Tyre. Macedonian troops poured through the breach while warships landed soldiers inside the city's harbors. Fierce fighting erupted in the narrow streets. The defenders resisted with extraordinary courage, but they could no longer stop the overwhelming assault. By the end of the day, Tyre had fallen. Alexander showed little mercy. Many of the city's inhabitants were killed during the fighting. Thousands more were sold into slavery. The destruction of Tyre sent shockwaves across the ancient world. The city that had resisted the greatest empires for centuries had finally been conquered. More importantly, Persia had lost one of its most valuable naval bases. Its dominance in the Mediterranean was rapidly disappearing. The Siege of Gaza. Alexander continued south along the coast. One final obstacle remained before Egypt. The fortress city of Gaza stood atop a high ridge overlooking the surrounding plains. Its commander refused to surrender. Once again, Alexander prepared for a siege. Massive earthworks were constructed to bring siege engines level with the city's walls. The defenders fought stubbornly. Repeated Macedonian assaults were driven back. During the fighting, Alexander himself was wounded. Yet, as he had done so many times before, he refused to leave the battlefield. After weeks of determined resistance, Gaza finally fell. With its capture, the road into Egypt lay completely open. Egypt welcomes a conqueror. Unlike many provinces of the Persian Empire, Egypt offered almost no resistance. For generations, many Egyptians had viewed Persian rule as foreign domination. When Alexander entered the country in 332 BC, he was welcomed not as an invader, but as a liberator. At Pelusium, the Persian governor surrendered the province without a fight. The royal treasury passed into Alexander's hands. Soon afterward, he traveled to Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt. There, Egyptian priests recognized him as the legitimate ruler of the land. In an elaborate ceremony, Alexander was crowned pharaoh. The young king of Macedonia had now become ruler of one of the world's oldest civilizations, the birth of Alexandria. While traveling along the Mediterranean coast, Alexander selected a site near the western branch of the Nile Delta for an ambitious new city. It would bear his own name, Alexandria. Its location was ideal. Protected by natural harbors and positioned between the Mediterranean Sea and the Nile, it was destined to become a center of commerce, learning, and culture. Although Alexander would never see the city reach its full glory, Alexandria would eventually become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Its famous library and lighthouse would be admired for centuries. Even today, the city remains one of Egypt's most important urban centers. The Oracle of Siwa. Alexander's journey through Egypt was not limited to conquest. He also traveled deep into the western desert to visit the sacred oasis of Siwa. Hidden among endless sands stood the famous Oracle of Ammonius, one of the most revered religious sites in the ancient world. Exactly what occurred inside the temple remains uncertain. Ancient writers offer different accounts. According to several traditions, the priests welcomed Alexander as the son of Ammonius, identifying him with the supreme Egyptian god. Whether they literally declared him divine or simply honored him as pharaoh has been debated ever since. Whatever happened inside the sanctuary profoundly affected Alexander. From this point onward, his belief in his own destiny appeared stronger than ever. Many of his followers also began to see him as a ruler chosen by the gods. A new phase of the war. After completing his campaign in Egypt, Alexander returned to Tyre. There, in 331 BC, troubling news arrived from Greece. Despite his extraordinary victories, not everyone accepted Macedonian rule. Encouraged by Persian support, King Agis of Sparta had launched a rebellion against Macedonia. At the same time, Antipater, Alexander's trusted governor in Greece, was already dealing with unrest in Thrace. The stability of Alexander's homeland suddenly appeared uncertain. But events in Greece would soon be resolved. And once they were, Alexander would finally march toward the heart of the Persian Empire itself. Ahead lay one final battle against Darius III. A battle that would decide the fate of an empire. Its name would become legendary. Gaugamela. Alexander the Great Part 6. Gaugamela, the battle that destroyed an empire. Rebellion in Greece. While Alexander was consolidating his control over Egypt, the situation back in Greece became increasingly unstable. Encouraged by Persian gold, King Agis of Sparta attempted to rally the Greek city-states against Macedonian rule. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Alexander's victories in Asia might be undone by rebellion at home. Fortunately for the young king, his trusted regent, Antipater, acted swiftly. Despite already suppressing unrest in Thrace, Antipater marched south to confront the Spartan army near Megalopolis. The battle ended in a decisive Macedonian victory. The Spartan army was shattered, and King Agis was killed fighting alongside his men. The rebellion collapsed almost immediately. Alexander's homeland was secure once again. Now nothing stood between him and the heart of the Persian Empire. Darius makes one final offer. As Alexander prepared to continue east, a message arrived from Darius III. The Persian king no longer underestimated his opponent. His previous defeats had forced him to seek another solution. Darius offered peace. His proposal was extraordinary. Alexander would receive an enormous ransom. He would marry one of Darius' daughters. He would also gain control of all Persian territory west of the Euphrates River. Many of Alexander's senior commanders believed the offer should be accepted. According to later tradition, Parmenion famously remarked, "If I were Alexander, I would accept these terms." Alexander's reply became equally famous. "So would I, if I were Parmenion." Alexander rejected every offer. He no longer sought half of the empire. He intended to rule all of it. The final confrontation was inevitable. The road to Gaugamela. News soon reached Alexander that Darius III had assembled another enormous army near Gaugamela, not far from modern Mosul in present-day Iraq. This time, the Persian king intended to choose the battlefield himself. Unlike Issus, where narrow terrain had neutralized his numerical advantage, the plains around Gaugamela were broad, flat, and carefully prepared. Persian engineers even leveled sections of the ground to ensure that war chariots could charge without obstruction. Everything had been designed for one decisive battle. Alexander marched directly toward it. Neither king intended to retreat. The armies assemble. Although ancient sources claimed the Persian army numbered several 100,000 soldiers, modern historians generally estimate that Darius III commanded somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 men. Even so, it remained a formidable force. The army represented nearly every nation within the Persian Empire. Infantry arrived from Babylonia and Syria. Cavalry rode in from Armenia, Central Asia, and even India. Among them were approximately 200 scythe chariots, specially designed to tear apart enemy formations with long blades mounted on their wheels. Darius also deployed several war elephants, an unfamiliar sight for most Macedonian soldiers. Alexander's army remained significantly smaller, but size had never been his greatest advantage. Discipline, training, and leadership had carried him this far. Alexander's battle plan. Alexander organized his army much as he had before. On the left wing stood Parmenion, commanding the Thessalian cavalry, supported by Greek allies. The center belonged once again to the veteran Macedonian phalanx. On the right wing, Alexander positioned himself alongside the companion cavalry, the Hydaspes, and his elite light infantry. This time, however, he introduced an important innovation. Behind the main battle line, he deployed a second line of infantry angled backward. Their purpose was clear. If Persian cavalry attempted to surround the Macedonian army, as Alexander expected, they would find fresh troops waiting. Every detail of the deployment anticipated the enemy's strategy. The battle begins. As dawn broke over Gaugamela, both armies stood silently across the open plain. Neither commander underestimated the importance of the coming battle. Alexander knew that victory would open the road to the capitals of the Persian Empire. Darius understood that another defeat could cost him everything. Instead of launching an immediate attack, Alexander made an unexpected move. He advanced slowly toward his right. At first, the maneuver confused the Persians. Some believed Alexander intended to avoid battle altogether. Others feared he was attempting to outflank their line. Darius reacted exactly as Alexander had hoped. To prevent being outmaneuvered, he shifted large numbers of cavalry away from his center. The Persian battle line stretched farther and farther across the plain. In doing so, it created something Alexander had been waiting for. Gaps. Small at first, then larger. The center of the Persian army gradually weakened. Alexander had set the trap. The charge of the chariots. Realizing Alexander's intentions, Darius III committed one of his most feared weapons. The scythed chariots thundered forward. Dozens of horses accelerated across the battlefield, pulling vehicles fitted with razor-sharp blades designed to cut through infantry formations. The Macedonian army remained calm. Alexander had prepared for exactly this moment. The Agrianians advanced first. Their javelins struck horses and drivers before the chariots reached the main line. Other chariots encountered unexpected gaps deliberately opened by Macedonian infantry. Instead of crashing into a solid wall of soldiers, they passed harmlessly through empty lanes. Once beyond the front line, they were surrounded and destroyed. The terrifying weapon that Darius had trusted failed almost completely. Alexander seized his opportunity. Now came the decisive moment. Alexander saw that the Persian center had become dangerously exposed. Without hesitation, he gathered the companion cavalry. Behind them marched selected units of the Macedonian phalanx. Then Alexander gave the command. The cavalry surged forward. It was one of the most famous charges in military history. Rather than attacking the strongest part of the Persian line, Alexander drove directly into the opening his earlier maneuver had created. The impact was devastating. Persian infantry struggled to close the gap. Companion cavalry smashed through the weakened center. The Macedonian king once again aimed for a single objective: Darius III himself. The king flees again. As Alexander drew closer, panic spread through the Persian command. For the second time in 2 years, the great king found himself threatened personally. His elite guards fought desperately to protect him. But the Macedonian assault continued to gain momentum. Then, history repeated itself. Darius III turned his chariot and fled. The sight was catastrophic for Persian morale. The King of Kings was abandoning the battlefield. Thousands of soldiers immediately lost the will to fight. Entire formations broke apart. What had begun as an organized defense rapidly dissolved into chaos. The center of the Persian army collapsed. Alexander had broken the greatest empire on earth. Alexander the Great Part 7. The Fall of Persia. Parmenions' desperate fight. While Alexander's cavalry tore through the Persian center, the battle was far from over. On the Macedonian left, the situation had become critical. Parmenion faced the strongest concentration of Persian cavalry on the battlefield. Wave after wave of mounted warriors crashed against his exhausted troops. The pressure was relentless. Persian horsemen began pushing around the Macedonian flank, threatening to surround the entire army. In several places, the battle line nearly collapsed. Some Persian cavalry even broke through a gap in the Macedonian formation. For a brief moment, disaster seemed possible. Instead of attacking Alexander's army from the rear, however, many of these cavalrymen galloped toward the Macedonian camp, hoping to seize supplies and treasure. Their decision proved to be a fatal mistake. What could have become a decisive tactical victory turned into little more than looting. Meanwhile, Parmenion desperately held his ground. Realizing his position was becoming untenable, he sent urgent messengers to Alexander requesting immediate support. Alexander's difficult choice. At that very moment, Alexander was pursuing Darius III. The Persian king had fled the battlefield once again, abandoning what remained of his army. Victory seemed within reach. If Alexander continued the pursuit, he might finally capture the great king and end the war forever. Then Parmenion's message arrived. Alexander faced one of the most difficult decisions of his career. Should he continue chasing Darius, or save the army that had carried him across Asia? Without hesitation, he chose his men. He ordered the pursuit halted. Turning the companion cavalry around, Alexander raced back toward the battlefield. It was a decision that probably allowed Darius to escape. But it also saved the Macedonian army. The final collapse. Alexander reached the left wing just as the fighting reached its most desperate stage. The arrival of the companion cavalry transformed the battle. Fresh Macedonian horsemen smashed into the Persian cavalry from the flank. A brutal cavalry engagement followed. Ancient accounts describe it as some of the bloodiest fighting of Alexander's entire campaign. Nearly 60 companions lost their lives during the struggle. Yet the result was never truly in doubt. News spread rapidly across the battlefield. The great king had fled. Once the remaining Persian cavalry learned that Darius III had abandoned them, resistance collapsed. One unit after another turned away from the fighting. Soon the entire Persian army was retreating. The Battle of Gaugamela was over. Alexander had won the greatest victory of his life. The road to Babylon. The defeat at Gaugamela destroyed Persian military power. For the first time in over 2 centuries, the empire stood completely exposed. No major army remained to defend its capitals. Alexander advanced south. His next destination was the legendary city of Babylon. Unlike many cities before it, Babylon offered no resistance. Its priests, nobles, and officials welcomed Alexander as the empire's new ruler. The magnificent city opened its gates peacefully. For Alexander, the moment carried enormous symbolic importance. He had entered one of the oldest and most famous cities on Earth, not as a conqueror destroying civilization, but as the legitimate successor to the Persian kings. Its enormous wealth now belonged to Macedonia. Susa. Leaving Babylon behind, Alexander marched east toward Susa, another of the great capitals of the Persian Empire. Once again, the city surrendered without battle. Inside its royal treasury lay unimaginable riches. Gold, silver, jewels, centuries of accumulated imperial wealth. Ancient writers claimed the treasure stored in Susa was almost beyond calculation. For Alexander, these resources solved one of his greatest problems. His army would no longer depend on limited supplies carried from Greece. Now he possessed the financial strength of an empire. The Persian gates. One final natural barrier separated Alexander from the ceremonial heart of Persia, the rugged Zagros Mountains. Within them lay a narrow mountain pass known as the Persian Gates. Here, a determined Persian commander organized one last stand. The defenders occupied the high ground, where steep cliffs prevented Alexander from using his cavalry or deploying the phalanx effectively. As the Macedonians advanced into the pass, they suddenly came under a devastating rain of arrows, stones, and javelins. The attack threw Alexander's army into confusion. For one of the very few times during his Asian campaign, he was forced to retreat. The Persians celebrated. At last, they had stopped the seemingly unstoppable conqueror. But only temporarily. A path through the mountains. Alexander refused to accept defeat. Local guides informed him of a hidden mountain trail leading around the Persian position. The route was difficult, steep, and dangerous. Yet it offered something priceless. A chance to attack from behind. Leaving part of his army to occupy the defenders from the front, Alexander personally led a selected force through the mountains during the night. By dawn, the maneuver was complete. The Persians suddenly realized they were surrounded. Attacked from both directions, their defensive position collapsed. Most of the defenders were killed. The road into the Persian heartland was finally open. Persepolis. In early 330 BC, Alexander entered Persepolis. More than any other city, Persepolis symbolized the greatness of the Persian Empire. Although Babylon served as the empire's administrative center, Persepolis remained its ceremonial capital. Its magnificent palaces displayed generations of Persian wealth and royal authority. For Alexander, capturing the city represented far more than another military success. It marked the complete collapse of Achaemenid power. His soldiers entered a city overflowing with treasure. The wealth accumulated over centuries now passed into Macedonian hands. Yet Alexander soon made a decision historians still debate today. Fire in Persepolis. After allowing his soldiers to plunder the city, Alexander ordered Persepolis set ablaze. Ancient writers offer different explanations. Some believe the destruction was deliberate revenge for the burning of Athens during the Persian invasion of 480 BC. Others claimed the decision followed a drunken celebration inside one of the royal palaces. Whatever the reason, flames quickly consumed the magnificent complex. Columns collapsed. Roofs gave way. One of the greatest cities of the ancient world disappeared beneath smoke and fire. Centuries of Persian history were reduced to ruins. The burning of Persepolis became one of the defining moments of Alexander's conquest. The empire had not merely been defeated. Its greatest symbol had been destroyed. The hunt for Darius. Despite the fall of Persia's capitals, the war was not yet over. Darius III remained alive. The Persian king fled east toward Media, hoping to raise another army from the provinces of Parthia, Bactria, and Sogdia. Alexander refused to let him escape. He immediately organized a relentless pursuit across the Iranian plateau. This would no longer be a campaign to conquer cities. It would become a race across Asia. A race to capture the last king of kings before someone else did. But Alexander was not the only man hunting Darius. Within the Persian court itself, betrayal had already begun. Alexander the Great Part 8. The death of Darius and the rise of a new king. Betrayal within the Persian court. Following the destruction of Persepolis in 330 BC, Darius III fled east with the remnants of his court and the few loyal troops that still remained. Although the Persian Empire had lost its principal capitals, the great king refused to surrender. His plan was simple: retreat into the eastern provinces, raise another army, and continue the war. The eastern satrapies of Media, Parthia, Bactria, and Sogdia still possessed considerable manpower. If enough governors remained loyal, Persia might yet survive. But loyalty was becoming increasingly scarce. With every mile Alexander advanced, more nobles questioned whether Darius could still lead the empire. Among the most powerful was Bessus, the satrap of Bactria. Ambitious and influential, Bessus commanded a large cavalry force and believed the empire needed a stronger ruler. Soon, a conspiracy began to take shape. Alexander's relentless pursuit. Alexander understood that speed was now his greatest weapon. He left behind heavy baggage, siege equipment, and slow-moving supply trains. Only the fastest cavalry and elite infantry accompanied him. The chase became one of endurance rather than battle. Day after day, Macedonian soldiers crossed scorching plains, rocky deserts, and rugged mountain passes. The summer heat was relentless. Water was scarce. Exhaustion claimed almost as many men as combat. Ancient historians tell of one famous incident during the pursuit. A small group of soldiers discovered only a helmet filled with water after hours of searching. They brought it to Alexander. The king looked at the exhausted men around him. Then, without taking a single sip, he poured the water onto the ground. If his soldiers could not drink, neither would he. The gesture inspired the entire army. They continued marching. The murder of the great king. As Alexander drew closer, panic spread through the Persian leadership. Many nobles no longer believed Darius III could escape. Rather than allow the great king to fall alive into Macedonian hands, the conspirators acted first. Led by Bessus and several other senior officers, they arrested their own king. Darius was bound in chains and placed inside a wagon. When news arrived that Alexander's cavalry was only hours away, the conspirators made their final decision. They abandoned the king. Before fleeing, they stabbed Darius III multiple times and left him to die beside the road. It was the tragic end of the last ruler of the Achaemenid Empire. After more than 2 centuries of Persian rule, the dynasty founded by Cyrus the Great came to an end. Alexander finds Darius. Not long afterward, Macedonian scouts discovered the abandoned wagon. Inside lay the dying Persian king. According to ancient tradition, Darius III asked for water before succumbing to his wounds. By the time Alexander reached him, the great king was already dead. The young Macedonian reportedly covered Darius' body with his own royal cloak. Whether every detail of the story is true remains uncertain. What is well documented is Alexander's response. He ordered that Darius III receive a royal funeral according to Persian tradition. The body was sent to Persepolis for burial beside his royal ancestors. It was a remarkable gesture. Alexander no longer presented himself simply as the conqueror of Persia. He now claimed to be the rightful successor to its throne. King of Asia. With Darius III dead, no legitimate ruler of the Persian Empire remained. Alexander adopted many elements of Persian royal ceremony. He retained experienced Persian officials within the government. Many satraps who accepted his authority were allowed to keep their positions. Rather than destroy the empire's administration, Alexander chose to preserve it. His goal was no longer conquest alone. He intended to govern one united empire stretching from Greece to Central Asia. Many Macedonian officers admired the policy. Others deeply resented it. They believed Alexander was becoming more Persian than Macedonian. These tensions would only grow stronger in the years ahead. Bessus declares himself king. Meanwhile, Bessus fled into Bactria. There, he proclaimed himself the new great king under the royal name Artaxerxes V. His hope was to unite the eastern provinces against Alexander. It was a bold gamble. If enough eastern satraps joined him, the war could continue for years. Alexander immediately rejected Bessus' claim. To him, Bessus was not a king. He was a traitor who had murdered his own sovereign. Alexander announced that Darius' assassin would be hunted down wherever he fled. The campaign now entered an entirely new phase. Instead of fighting organized imperial armies, Alexander would wage war across the vast frontiers of Central Asia. Into the unknown. Everything Alexander had accomplished so far had taken place within the civilized heartland of the Persian Empire. The lands ahead were different. Towering mountain ranges, endless deserts, and fierce tribal societies that had never accepted foreign rule. The provinces of Bactria and Sogdia would prove unlike anything the Macedonian army had faced before. There would be no great capitals waiting to surrender, no enormous treasuries to capture, no decisive battles capable of ending the war in a single day. Instead, Alexander would confront an enemy that refused to stand and fight. His opponents would disappear into mountains, deserts, and fortresses, forcing the Macedonians into a brutal campaign of pursuit, ambushes, and sieges. The easy victories were over. The hardest years of Alexander's career were only beginning. A new war begins. As the army marched deeper into Central Asia, many soldiers believed the conquest of Persia had already been completed. They expected to return home. Alexander had different plans. He intended to continue east, far beyond Bactria, beyond Sogdia, toward lands few Greeks had ever seen. Some officers questioned his ambition. Others followed without hesitation. None of them could imagine how far the journey would ultimately take them, or how many of them would never return. The conquest of the Persian Empire was over. The conquest of Asia had only just begun. Alexander the Great Part 9. The conquest of Central Asia. Into Bactria. With the death of Darius III in 330 BC, many believed the war had finally come to an end. Alexander disagreed. As long as Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, claimed the Persian throne under the name Artaxerxes V, there could be no peace. The Macedonian king pushed his army farther east than any Greek force had ever marched before. The fertile plains of Mesopotamia disappeared behind them. Ahead lay the harsh landscapes of Bactria and Sogdia, regions of towering mountains, endless steppes, and vast deserts. The campaign that followed would test Alexander and his soldiers more severely than any battle against the Persian Empire. Crossing the Hindu Kush. To reach Bactria, Alexander first had to cross the mighty Hindu Kush mountains. Even today, these mountains are among the most formidable in Asia. For an ancient army, the crossing was a nightmare. The soldiers climbed narrow trails carved into frozen cliffs. Many struggled to breathe in the thin mountain air. Snow covered the highest passes despite the changing seasons. Pack animals slipped from the rocky paths and disappeared into deep ravines below. Food became increasingly scarce. Entire units survived on dried meat and whatever grain remained in their supplies. Yet Alexander continued to march at the front of the column. Like his soldiers, he endured every hardship without asking for special treatment. His determination kept the army moving. Eventually, the Macedonians descended into the rich valleys of Bactria. The flight of Bessus. News of Alexander's arrival spread rapidly. Rather than risk open battle, Bessus withdrew eastward. He ordered bridges destroyed and settlements abandoned behind him, hoping to slow the Macedonian advance. Alexander answered with speed. His cavalry covered astonishing distances each day, denying Bessus any opportunity to regroup. Support for the self-proclaimed king quickly began to collapse. Many Persian nobles no longer trusted the man who had betrayed Darius III. One by one, his own commanders abandoned him. Finally, several of Bessus' officers arrested him and handed him over to Alexander. The man who had declared himself the ruler of the Persian Empire now stood in chains before the conqueror. Justice for Darius. Alexander viewed Bessus not simply as an enemy. He considered him a traitor. By murdering Darius III, Bessus had violated the traditions of Persian kingship. Alexander intended to show that such betrayal would never be tolerated. According to ancient sources, Bessus was publicly humiliated before receiving his sentence. His punishment reflected Persian custom for treason. Eventually, he was executed. With Bessus dead, no rival claimant to the Persian throne remained. Alexander could now present himself as the undisputed king of Asia. Yet victory proved far more complicated than expected. The eastern provinces refused to submit. A different kind of war. Unlike the great battles at Granicus, Issus, or Gaugamela, the fighting in Bactria and Sogdia had no clear front lines. The enemy avoided open battle. Instead, local leaders relied on guerrilla tactics. Small cavalry detachments struck isolated Macedonian units before disappearing into deserts, forests, and mountain valleys. Supply convoys became frequent targets. Communication between garrisons grew increasingly dangerous. Every valley concealed another ambush. Every mountain pass might hide enemy warriors. Alexander discovered that conquering territory was far easier than controlling it. The rise of Spitamines. The most dangerous resistance leader was Spitamines, a powerful noble from Sogdia. Unlike previous Persian commanders, Spitamines refused to confront Alexander in a conventional battle. He understood the strengths of the Macedonian army. Instead of attacking its strongest formations, he targeted its weaknesses. His cavalry moved with incredible speed across the open plains. Whenever Macedonian forces advanced, Spitamines disappeared. Whenever they withdrew, he struck without warning. Entire garrisons suddenly found themselves isolated. Several Macedonian detachments were destroyed before help could arrive. For the first time since crossing into Asia, Alexander faced an opponent he could neither trap nor predict. The revolt of Sogdia. The rebellion spread rapidly. Cities that had previously surrendered now rose against Macedonian rule. Fortresses that appeared secure suddenly found themselves under siege from local tribes. Alexander responded with relentless determination. He divided his army into multiple mobile columns, allowing his commanders to react more quickly to sudden attacks. New fortresses were built throughout the region. Roads were secured. Supply depots were established. The campaign became one of occupation rather than conquest. It demanded patience instead of dramatic victories. Even so, the rebellion continued. The Sogdian Rock. One fortress appeared completely untouchable. Known as the Sogdian Rock, it stood high upon steep cliffs that seemed impossible to climb. Its defenders mocked Alexander openly. According to ancient tradition, they declared that the Macedonians would need soldiers with wings before the fortress could ever fall. Alexander accepted the challenge. He asked for volunteers. Around 300 soldiers, many experienced mountain climbers, stepped forward. During the night, using iron tent pegs and ropes, they climbed the nearly vertical cliffs behind the fortress. The ascent was terrifying. Several men lost their footing and fell to their deaths. But before sunrise, the survivors reached the summit. When daylight revealed Macedonian soldiers standing above the supposedly impregnable fortress, the defenders were stunned. Believing the impossible had happened, they surrendered without a fight. It became one of Alexander's most extraordinary victories, won not through overwhelming force, but through courage and ingenuity. Roxana. Among those captured after the surrender of the Sogdian rock was Roxana, the daughter of the local noble Oxyartes. Ancient writers described her as one of the most beautiful women in Asia. Alexander was immediately captivated. Rather than treating her family as defeated enemies, he welcomed them into his court. Soon afterward, Alexander married Roxana. The marriage carried both personal and political significance. It strengthened Macedonian relations with influential nobles across Bactria and Sogdia. For many local leaders, it demonstrated that Alexander intended to unite his empire rather than rule solely through conquest. Not everyone approved. Many Macedonian officers believed their king was abandoning traditional Macedonian customs in favor of Persian traditions. The growing tension within Alexander's own army became increasingly difficult to ignore. A changing king. As the years passed, Alexander himself began to change. He adopted elements of Persian royal dress. Persian nobles received high positions within his administration. Court ceremonies became more elaborate. Some customs deeply offended his Macedonian companions. They had followed Alexander across thousands of miles as equals in battle. Now many feared their king was becoming a distant Eastern monarch. Whispers of dissatisfaction spread through the officer corps. Old friendships began to weaken. Trust slowly eroded. The greatest threat to Alexander's empire might no longer come from foreign enemies. It could come from within his own ranks. The road to India. By 327 BC, organized resistance throughout Bactria and Sogdia had finally begun to collapse. After years of exhausting warfare, Alexander had secured the eastern frontier of his empire. His soldiers expected the long-awaited journey home. Instead, Alexander announced another campaign. Far beyond the towering mountains lay a mysterious land known to the Greeks as India. Stories spoke of wealthy kingdoms, vast rivers, strange animals, and armies supported by terrifying war elephants. Most of Alexander's men believed they had already marched farther than any army in history. Their king believed they had only reached the halfway point. The greatest adventure of his life was still ahead. Alexander the Great final part. India, the end of the journey, and an eternal legacy. Into India. By 327 BC, Alexander had spent nearly 7 years campaigning across Asia. He had defeated the Persian Empire, crossed the towering mountains of Bactria and Sogdia, and extended his rule farther east than any Greek king before him. Most of his soldiers believed the campaign was finally over. Instead, Alexander announced yet another invasion. Beyond the eastern frontier lay the rich kingdoms of India. To the Greeks, it was a mysterious land filled with powerful rulers, immense rivers, exotic wildlife, and enormous war elephants unlike anything they had ever encountered. Once again, the Macedonian army marched forward. Across the Indus. After crossing the Hindu Kush once more, Alexander descended toward the Indus River. Several local rulers accepted his authority without resistance. Among them was King Taxiles, ruler of Taxila, who welcomed Alexander as an ally rather than an enemy. The alliance proved invaluable. Taxiles supplied provisions, guides, and fresh troops for the campaign deeper into India. Not every ruler chose diplomacy. One king prepared to resist. His name was Porus. The Battle of the Hydaspes. In 326 BC, Alexander reached the banks of the Hydaspes River, where King Porus awaited him with a powerful army. The river itself posed the first challenge. Heavy rain had swollen its waters, making a direct crossing almost impossible. Meanwhile, Porus positioned thousands of soldiers and more than 200 war elephants along the opposite bank. Any attempt to cross would likely end in disaster. Alexander responded with deception. Night after night, his army marched along the riverbank, creating the illusion that a crossing might happen anywhere. The Indian army remained on constant alert, exhausting both men and animals. Then, during a violent thunderstorm, Alexander secretly moved part of his army upstream. Using boats, rafts, and improvised floats, his soldiers crossed the flooded river under cover of darkness. By dawn, the Macedonians stood safely on the opposite bank. Porus immediately advanced to meet them. The decisive battle had begun. War elephants. The Battle of the Hydaspes became unlike any engagement Alexander had ever fought. For the first time, his army faced large numbers of trained war elephants. Towering above both cavalry and infantry, the animals crashed into the Macedonian lines, spreading fear and confusion. Horses panicked at their scent. Long tusks shattered shields. Massive feet crushed soldiers beneath them. Even the disciplined Macedonian phalanx struggled against such opponents. Alexander adapted quickly. Instead of attacking the elephants directly, his troops targeted their handlers with arrows and javelins. As more mahouts were killed, many elephants became uncontrollable. Some turned back into the Indian ranks, trampling their own soldiers. Slowly, the balance shifted. Meanwhile, Alexander and the companion cavalry repeatedly attacked Porus' flanks, gradually surrounding the Indian army. After hours of brutal combat, resistance finally collapsed. Alexander and Porus. Unlike many defeated rulers, King Porus refused to flee. Even after suffering numerous wounds, he continued fighting until his army could no longer resist. Eventually, he was captured and brought before Alexander. According to ancient tradition, Alexander asked him a simple question. "How should I treat you?" Porus answered, "Treat me as a king." Impressed by his courage and dignity, Alexander not only restored Porus to his throne, but expanded his kingdom, making him one of the most powerful allies in India. It was another example of Alexander's willingness to reward loyalty and bravery, even in former enemies. The end of the eastward march. Following the victory at the Hydaspes River, Alexander wished to continue farther east. He dreamed of reaching the Ganges River and perhaps even the Eastern Ocean beyond. His soldiers had reached their limit. For years they had marched across deserts, mountains, forests, and battlefields. Many had not seen their families since leaving Macedonia. News reached the camp that even larger kingdoms awaited beyond the Ganges, with armies numbering hundreds of thousands and thousands of war elephants. The Macedonian veterans refused to go farther. For the first time in his career, Alexander faced open resistance from his own army. At the Hydaspes River, his officers spoke on behalf of the exhausted soldiers. Despite several days of persuasion, no one changed their mind. Alexander finally accepted reality. After nearly a decade of continuous conquest, the march east had come to an end. Reluctantly, he ordered the army to turn back. The long journey home. Returning proved no easier than advancing. Part of the army sailed down the Indus River, while Alexander led another force overland. After reaching the coast, he made one of the most controversial decisions of his career. Rather than following safer routes, he chose to cross the vast Gadrosian Desert. The consequences were devastating. Scorching temperatures, constant thirst, and endless sand exhausted both men and animals. Water was almost impossible to find. Thousands perished from dehydration and starvation. Entire baggage trains disappeared beneath shifting dunes. Ancient historians regarded the crossing of the Gadrosian Desert as one of the greatest hardships Alexander's army ever endured. When the survivors finally emerged from the desert, they were only a fraction of the force that had entered it. The weddings at Susa. In 324 BC, Alexander returned to Susa. There, he introduced one of the boldest political experiments of his reign. Seeking to unite Macedonians and Persians into a single ruling elite, he organized a massive royal wedding ceremony. Alexander himself married Statira II, a daughter of Darius III. At the same event, dozens of Macedonian officers married Persian noblewomen. The ceremonies symbolized Alexander's vision of a multicultural empire. Not everyone welcomed the idea. Many Macedonian veterans believed their traditions were being replaced by Persian customs. The divide between king and army continued to widen. The death of Hydaspes. Later that same year, tragedy struck. Alexander's closest friend and most trusted companion, Hydaspes, fell seriously ill in Ecbatana. Despite every effort by physicians, he died. Alexander was devastated. Ancient writers describe his grief as overwhelming. He ordered public mourning across the empire. Temples closed. Festivals were suspended. Magnificent funeral ceremonies honored the man who had stood beside him since childhood. Many historians believe Alexander never fully recovered from the loss of Hephaestion. Babylon. In 323 BC, Alexander arrived in Babylon. His empire now stretched from Greece and Egypt to the borders of India. He was only 32 years old. New campaigns were already being planned. Arabia would likely be his next objective. Perhaps beyond that. No one truly knew how far Alexander intended to go. Then, unexpectedly, everything changed. After attending a series of banquets, Alexander became seriously ill. For nearly 2 weeks, his condition worsened. Ancient sources describe fever, weakness, and the gradual loss of his ability to speak. Despite the efforts of his physicians, there was nothing they could do. In June 323 BC, Alexander died in Babylon. The exact cause remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Modern historians have proposed illnesses such as malaria, typhoid fever, or other natural diseases. Others have suggested poisoning, though convincing evidence has never been found. The truth remains unknown. To the strongest. As Alexander lay dying, his generals reportedly asked who should inherit his empire. According to one ancient tradition, he answered with only 2 words. To the strongest. Whether those were his actual final words remains uncertain. What followed is beyond dispute. Without a clear adult heir, the greatest empire of the ancient world immediately began to fracture. Alexander's generals, the Diadochi, turned against one another. Years of brutal wars followed. The empire was eventually divided into powerful Hellenistic kingdoms. Although politically fragmented, Alexander's achievements endured. An immortal legacy. Alexander ruled for only 13 years. He lived only 32 years. Yet during that brief lifetime, he permanently transformed the ancient world. He destroyed the Achaemenid Empire, one of history's greatest superpowers. He founded more than 20 cities, many bearing the name Alexandria. Greek language, philosophy, science, architecture, and art spread across the Middle East, Egypt, and Central Asia, giving rise to the Hellenistic Age. The civilization that emerged from his conquests influenced the Roman Empire, shaped early Christianity, inspired Islamic scholars, and helped preserve the knowledge of the ancient world for future generations. More than 2,000 years after his death, military academies still study his campaigns. Historians continue to debate his ambitions. Writers celebrate his victories. And countless legends surround his life. Some remember him as a visionary who united civilizations. Others see him as a conqueror whose wars claimed countless lives. Perhaps he was both. But one truth remains beyond question. From the moment a young king crossed the Hellespont in 334 BC, history would never be the same again. The world remembers him by the title he earned through extraordinary ambition, unmatched courage, and relentless determination. Alexander the Great.